I think many in the human rights community, among others, were disappointed by Biden's action to release the intelligence findings in the Khashoggi murder and then essentially take no action. Basically, here he releases these findings, but then he does nothing to actually follow up on them and punish this crime, which I think was disappointing for a lot of people.
That's the voice of film director, author, and human rights activist, Bryan Fogel. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. It is Budget Day in Washington, and we are recording this episode on Friday, May 28th, as the Biden administration is expected to release its plans for federal spending later today. But some details are already emerging.
Please tell me you're covering this on early warning.
Yes, Michelle, we will stay on the question of the budget. We'll tell you about the budget numbers that have come out so far, including what appears to be full funding for major nuclear weapons programs. And then we'll discuss a recent report by the Congressional Budget Office that estimates the total cost for these programs and how these costs are rising. So please stay tuned.
This week's episode's interview is led by Farshad Farahat, actor, director, and board member of Ploughshares Fund. He sits down with Bryan Fogel, Academy Award-winning filmmaker, as well as producer, author, playwright, speaker, and human rights activist. They discuss Bryan's latest work, The Dissident, a documentary which chronicles the 2018 assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. It paints a portrait of Khashoggi's life and work and what led to his tragic death. Fogel highlights the importance of speaking truth to power and giving a voice to the oppressed. It's a fascinating documentary that reveals the challenges of the freedom movement in Saudi Arabia, so please stay tuned.
And as usual, if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit helps to grow our show and our audience, and we really appreciate it. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. The Biden administration's annual budget request to Congress will be released later today. So we don't have all the details for you, but some numbers have started to seep out. And it is not a pretty picture when it comes to nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, it looks like the Biden team is moving ahead with all aspects of nuclear modernization programs, but more on that in a minute. Earlier this week, the Congressional Budget Office released its latest review of what the U.S. government plans to spend on nuclear weapons over the next 10 years. The answer is $634 billion, an increase of 28% from just 2 years ago. This is an average of about $60 billion a year. And for comparison, $60 billion is twice what we spend on the State Department. So you can get 2 State Departments for that. And almost as much as we spend on education. So it's a lot of money. And back in 2017, CBO estimated that the cost of nuclear weapons over 30 years would be $1.7 trillion with inflation. Here to help us understand these huge costs, we have Kingston Reif. He is Director of Disarmament and Threat Reduction at the Arms Control Association. Kingston, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kingston, you have been tracking Biden's first budget. Tell us what you know so far about the nuclear plans.
So, as you've mentioned, Tom, some of the early details from the administration's fiscal year 22 budget submission have started to come out as we're recording this. And unfortunately, the early indications are that the administration plans to proceed full steam ahead with the nuclear modernization plans that it inherited from the Trump administration. What we know so far about the budget request, we know some of the details from the Air Force's budget submission. Of course, the Air Force funds the current plans to, for example, replace our current fleet of Minuteman III ICBMs with an entirely new ICBM system via the so-called Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program. The Trump administration was planning to request a major increase in fiscal year 2022 for the GBSD program, $2.5 billion. And the Biden administration's budget includes exactly what the Trump administration proposed to request. So it's full steam ahead, it appears.
Now, many of us have been advocating that the Biden administration should pause the new ICBM program pending a more comprehensive policy review that they're planning to do later this year. This still seems like an extremely prudent thing to do from my point of view. Why do you think the administration decided to press ahead in this way?
I agree with you that the prudent thing to have done, given the continued questions surrounding the need and affordability of the GBSD program, would have been to pursue a strategic pause pending the outcome of a more comprehensive nuclear policy review, in which the administration really could have dug deep into the rationale and need for this particular program. As your listeners know, we have raised several questions about the rationale and believe that there are less expensive alternatives available than the GBSD program to sustaining the ICBM leg of the triad. But without having any inside information, my sense is that the administration came to the opposite conclusion, that they could keep the program moving forward but nonetheless review it as part of the nuclear posture review. And if they decide to make any changes to the current plans for modernizing the ICBM fleet, they could still do that, and that this budget request wouldn't preclude them from doing so. I disagree with that rationale, but my sense is that that's how they plan to proceed. And there's no doubt strong support for continuing the status quo within the Pentagon. And so the new administration no doubt understood that and clearly decided not to change course here.
Well, let's hope if this larger budget for the new ICBM does come to pass, that it does not make it too big to fail, as we say in the biz. Turning now to the new CBO report that came out earlier this week. Help us understand where all this money is going beyond the systems we just talked about. What's it for, and what are the big ticket items?
Sure. So I think it's useful to just, before talking about the CBO report, to just briefly step back and review some of the history with respect to the U.S. modernization program. So during the Cold War, the United States replaced its nuclear forces in two major waves. And now the third wave of modernization is now upon us. The Obama administration, as I'm sure your listeners know, committed to a major overhaul of the nuclear arsenal in 2010 as part of its effort to win Republican support in the Senate for the New START treaty. And the plans aim to replace existing strategic nuclear delivery systems with similar numbers of new or refurbished systems. And significant investments are also being made to upgrade the nuclear command, control, and communications architecture, as well as the Energy Department's nuclear warheads and their supporting infrastructure. So Obama got this started, and then spending really took off during the Trump administration, and the CBO report that was released earlier this week demonstrates that. If you have a look at the CBO report, you will see that about 2/3 of the projected $634 billion over the next decade is planned to be spent on the nuclear delivery systems and their warheads, as well as the supporting command and control. And then the other third is planned to be spent on the Energy Department's infrastructure to support and sustain the nuclear warheads. I think the biggest ticket items in the modernization effort are the Defense Department delivery system recapitalization programs. And those include the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program to replace the existing ICBM force, which we've already discussed, the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine program to build a fleet of 12 new ballistic missile submarines, and then the B-21 bomber to replace the current fleet of Air Force long-range strategic bombers. And each one of those programs is projected to cost over $100 billion just to buy and to acquire. And that doesn't include the costs associated with sustaining those systems over their estimated roughly 50-year service life. The Pentagon is also planning to purchase new fleets of air-launched and sea-launched cruise missiles. As I mentioned, the Pentagon is also planning to spend a significant sum to upgrade the U.S. nuclear command and control infrastructure to allow the President of the United States to actually command and, God forbid, and use nuclear weapons. And according to CBO, we're planning to spend nearly $100 billion over the next decade just on the command and control infrastructure.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but in your view, do we need all this, and can we get by with less?
So the answer, in my view, is no. We don't need all this. We can get by with less. During the campaign, President Biden said that the United States, quote, does not need new nuclear weapons, end quote, and that, quote, his administration will work to maintain a strong, credible deterrent while reducing our reliance and excessive expenditure on nuclear weapons, end quote. And I agree with the president. Current U.S. Nuclear weapons policies and spending plans exceed what is necessary for a credible nuclear deterrent. And the financial and opportunity costs of the current modernization plan are really rising fast. Now, the Biden administration undoubtedly is inheriting a far less hospitable security environment than what existed when President Obama left office in 2016. Of course, we hear almost daily about the advances that Russia and China are purportedly making with respect to modernizing their nuclear arsenals and developing new nuclear weapons capabilities. But in my view, this doesn't mean that the United States should follow suit or maintain a nuclear arsenal in excess to what is needed for deterrence. For example, with respect to Russia in 2013, the Obama administration determined that the security of the United States and its allies could be maintained while pursuing up to a 1/3 reduction in deployed nuclear weapons below the level included in the New START treaty. And I think the case for such a 1/3 reduction remains strong. The real big challenge here is that U.S. spending on nuclear weapons poses a major threat to security priorities more relevant to countering Moscow and Beijing and assuring allies such as pandemic defense and response, as well as pacing China's advancing conventional military capabilities.
So the Biden administration, since they've come into office, has talked about reducing the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategy. Do you think they'll do that? And what do you expect to be the next step on nuclear spending?
The answer to that one is I don't know. Biden has the right instincts, but then again, so did President Obama. And as we know, under his watch, the modernization program was initiated, and the scope and cost of that program expanded over the course of Obama's 8 years in office. And I think there are significant obstacles to the president's desire to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. policy and adjust the modernization plans. As I mentioned, the security environment is more difficult, and we've certainly seen an elevation of this idea of great power competition as sort of the organizing principle for U.S. defense strategy. There's support for the status quo within the Defense Department. There's support for the status quo inside Congress, and that support is bipartisan, even if it's not particularly strong or deep. And there's support from allies for the status quo. So in order to make the kind of changes that we believe are necessary and make the most sense for U.S. security, it's going to take strong leadership from the President of the United States personally, and engagement from the President of the United States personally in order to adjust U.S. policy to reflect the views that the President himself has rightly expressed.
Kingston, looks like we've got our work cut out for us. Thank you very much. Our time is up. It's been a pleasure, and we'll talk again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Join us for Momentum Chain Reaction 2021 on Monday, June 7th, live via Zoom, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Together, we'll commemorate 40 years of bold action by Ploughshares Fund to promote peace and security around the world and to celebrate the momentum we carry forward to position people, not nuclear weapons, at the forefront of our national security and budget priorities. The event is free and open to all, For more information, visit plowshares.org/chainreaction2021.
My name is Hatice Genius. I am addressing you as a victim, a title forced on me after the brutal murder of my Jamal.
Jamal Khashoggi, prominent Saudi journalist and Washington Post columnist, has gone missing after visiting his country's consulate in Istanbul.
He was last seen entering Saudi Arabia's consulate seeking paperwork to marry his fiancée.
His fiancée saw him go in at 1 p.m. and was still waiting for him at 1 a.m.
Buhar olup uçmadı.
Saudi Arabia now suddenly is admitting that Khashoggi did die inside that building.
Welcome everyone to Press the Button. My guest today is Bryan Fogel. Bryan is an Academy Award-winning filmmaker, a producer, author, playwright, and human rights activist. His latest work is The Dissident, a documentary which chronicles the 2018 assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The Dissident paints a lasting portrait of Jamal Khashoggi's life and work, and it documents the events that led to his brutal murder. Bryan, thank you for such a powerful film, and welcome to Press the Button.
Nice to be talking to you all.
Bryan, the Dissident examines Jamal Khashoggi's journey as a journalist, reformist, and as ultimately a dissident, with a common thread of speaking truth to power. The film quotes that Khashoggi couldn't stop saying what he thought was true, which turned him from the ultimate reformist inside the regime to an absolute dissident outside the government. Can you tell us about his transformation and what truth Jamal, and by extension, the film, was able to reveal?
I never personally met Jamal. I mean, I became aware of his story, I think, much as the world did upon learning of his murder and him entering that Saudi consulate. So my understanding of Jamal really came, post-mortem and through research that was being done for the project, for the film. I'd brought on several Arabic speakers, Turkish speakers, and my own research. And, Jamal never, considered himself a dissident. That was not something that he would refer to himself as. I mean, he thought of himself as a journalist, and I would call him, moderate politically, and someone who, after years and years and years of being involved in the Saudi government, saw a situation that his country was not heading on the right path based on the policies of MBS, of Mohammed bin Salman. And these writings and his subsequent action that he took on Twitter and with the Washington Post, and then working with Omar Abdulaziz and others, I think, really ultimately led to what we would consider being a dissident, which is someone who is in opposition of their government in charge. And, and that transformation for Jamal, I think, it was a slow process. And as we see in the film, what happens is a series of his friends are arrested. He's contacted through Mohammed bin Salman's, entourage, Saad al-Qahtani, and told not to write anymore, not to tweet anymore. Essentially, he was being silenced, and that process of being silenced, ultimately led to where we found ourselves, and Jamal fleeing Saudi Arabia, going to Washington and beginning to write for the Washington Post, and that next year of his life that ultimately leads to his murder.
It is a gut-wrenching transformation in what you've presented so well in a strong documentary format that at times it felt like a spy thriller, and it was moving as a spy thriller. Can you describe for our listeners your process in developing and directing the film as a documentary, but also a movie that moves so fast? It felt like a spy thriller.
Well, there was a clear intention and direction from myself and my creative team, many of which we worked on Icarus together too. And that was, from the outset, looked at the film as being a thriller. I mean, tragically, but the story has all the makings of a Hollywood thriller. I mean, you have Omar as the protagonist, you have Hatice as the love interest, you have the Turkish police and examiners as the cops and investigators, and then you have the victim and the murder mystery with Jamal. So in that framework, in that story context, that's a thriller. And while the film could have been crafted as whatever you might want to call it, a more traditional documentary, our goal, my goal, my creative team's goal was to present something that as you sit down to watch the film, you're going to be hopefully riveted. And because it plays in such a manner that is of a thriller with sound and music, visual effects, design, that hopefully you care more, that you become more emotionally connected to the story, that you're more engaged as a viewer, and that those cinematic techniques that we are using in the editing and the craft of the film helps to engage the viewer. But yes, I mean, there was a very conscious decision made to craft the film as a thriller, because I also think that Jamal's story and the story that we tell in the film is a, sadly real life thriller.
Absolutely. And that does make it land, and that does capture your attention. Bryan, The Dissident is ultimately a film about freedom. And despite the recent U.S. pledge of ending its support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, Saudi Arabia is still the largest recipient of U.S. military arms sales, and President Biden has recently backed away from his campaign pledge to hold Saudi Arabia and its crown prince accountable for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. How does this continued U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East affect the freedom movement in Saudi Arabia and across the region?
I think many in the human rights community, among others, were disappointed by Biden's action to release the intelligence findings in the Khashoggi murder and then essentially take no action. Basically, here he releases these findings, but then he does nothing to actually follow up on them and punish this crime, which I think was disappointing for a lot of people. But speaking as an outsider, I think that it sends a message, very sadly, that these sort of actions by authoritarian leaders that have the wherewithal and the financial backing and the power to carry out murders such as this will be tolerated. Look, we've seen this from Russia from a number of years that, Putin goes and poisons Navalny, Skripal, Litvinenko, et cetera, And ultimately, I think, members of the G20, the United States, the UK, Germany, et cetera, ultimately go, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to go to war with Russia? Are we going to stop trade with Russia? And clearly that decision to not do that enables, a leader like Putin, or in this case, MBS, to say, okay, I can do these things. Well, they might be frowned upon and they might catch a lot of kind of international slack and a lot of bad press. Ultimately, is there really a punishment? Is something happening? And the answer is no. And so I think that in the aftermath of this murder and the collective, not just the Biden administration, the collective G20 action, as well as, big global corporate companies and banks and hedge funds and venture capital funds, et cetera, that have all continued to do business with the kingdom, I think it's sending the message that these sorts of crimes will remain unpunished so far as there's enough money and investment to make it go away.
To follow up on that, and as you mentioned, Omar Abdulaziz, the Montreal-based blogger and close friend of Jamal's, is a central voice of your film. And each of his interviews has a sense of extreme danger and risk. Can you describe what it was like to capture those scenes and his perspective? And has the film helped amplify his work? Is he in further danger these days?
Omar has said that there's over 100 of his friends that remain in prison. Apparently, in the film, it's 23 and his two brothers, but in the aftermath of the film, or not aftermath of the film, over the last couple of years, they have arrested several others that were in any sort of communication with Omar. Most of these people were communicating, as friends, not as dissidents. But apparently, according to Omar, there's over 100 activists and friends of his that were in his orbit that remain jailed without charges. He still is under the protection of Canadian intelligence and Canadian authorities. So, the situation as we see in the end of the film, which now, is about a year old, at least in what's the information in the film, really remains unchanged. I mean, where the film ends and where Omar is in that situation is identical today as it was a year ago.
Thank you for sharing that. And there's a touching love story within this film featuring Khashoggi's fiancée, Hatice, whom you've spent 5 weeks working with. How did that process develop? How did you build the trust with her to be part of this film? I found her to be an extremely powerful voice, an extremely eloquent voice for your film.
Trust building and building trust takes time. In the aftermath of Jamal's murder, I set out to engage and build trust with both Omar and Hatice. And about a month after his murder, I found myself in Istanbul, where I spent about 5 weeks just getting to know Hatice, meeting with her, having coffees, going to have food. And obviously it was a very, very, very difficult time for her. And, we weren't filming, we weren't shooting. We were just getting to know each other and building, a friendship that she would feel safe in working with me. The same goes with Omar, and the same goes with the Turks, the Turkish police and Turkish intelligence and the president's office. These pieces of information, additional evidence, police footage, were all that, the journey of Hatice. All of that took time. It was a slow process because we were going into real lives and real situations, and there was no rush. There was no panic among me and my collaborators to just go shoot. We were there also to emotionally support Hatice and Omar to, try to help best tell that story as we could, and also allow it to unfold organically. And so many of the events in the film that do unfold are unfolding, long after Jamal's death.
During that process, did the Saudi government factor into making the film? Were you or your crew under any type of threat or pressure from the government while you were on the ground?
I didn't feel anything. And there was also a conscientious choice that I made, my team made as we were going, that I didn't see any purpose in engaging with the kingdom. I didn't need any interviews from them. I didn't want any interviews from them because in my mind, there was nothing that they were going to say. We already know what their thoughts were, which was they were going to deny, or, go, hey, we didn't know what was happening. And that's fine. And I also didn't want to give credence or lend a voice additionally to what I viewed was an indefensible murder. So there was never any, engagement with the kingdom while making the film.
Your film very effectively and visually points out the problem of bots attacking activists and pro-democracy movement organizations. Example, Iranian Americans, I'm an Iranian American myself, here who promote the nuclear deal or some rapprochement diplomatically between the U.S. and Iran are constantly attacked by bots. In your experience of developing this film, how can social media outlets combat and eliminate bots from using their platforms to attack activists? Is there a path for them to regulate this growing problem?
I don't know. I'm not a tech guy, so I don't understand the programming within, Twitter, Facebook, these environments where people can be targeted or, accounts like this, as you see, obviously, in the film, how Omar was targeted and how Jamal was targeted and how this, ultimately or arguably was a big factor in his murder. I think the same thing that allows these platforms to have freedom of speech, to have the ability for activists to go create accounts under pseudonyms or in different countries using VPNs, et cetera. The same issues that we find when it's abused, that these accounts are being fraudulently created, or you can target people and go after them as we see in the film. So I don't know what the solution is. I think it's a very slippery slope for companies like Twitter and like Facebook. I'm sure, if they had control of it, or if they truly had control of it, they wouldn't want these things happening on their platform. But then it gets into very complicated discussions of, okay, well, if you do this and you start, let's say, making everyone authenticate who they are and this, that, and the other, well, that also puts activists in danger because now there's an authentication of who this person is. So it can work for and against, and it's clearly complicated.
You hit it on the head. I asked because it was the first time I had seen someone tackle this issue directly of bots influencing the root causes of this conflict. And as you so eloquently say, it does cut both ways. At Ploughshares Fund, we have what's called the Coles Fund, an endowed fund that promotes understanding of root causes of conflict in unstable regions. How did making The Dissident help you better understand the root causes of conflict in Saudi Arabia and the greater region?
I'd say that you have a authoritarian regime, essentially a dictatorship functioning under the auspices of a monarchy, or in other countries in this part of the world that wants to control all the money and control all the power. And by allowing freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of gathering, freedom of revolt, freedom of all these kind of things that come in what would otherwise be considered somewhat of a democracy, right? These rulers feel threatened. And what we take away, and we get into this and into the film a little bit, is what happened during the Arab Spring, right? Where everybody in the region was able to take to Twitter. It was an incredibly powerful medium for activists. Ultimately, it leads to the Arab Spring, and 2 years later, it's suppressed as al-Sisi then comes into power. But what these monarchies and authoritarian regimes learned was the power of social media, was the power of these platforms, and then they sought to control it. So I think, what we learned from this is not so much the conflicts in the region, because we're not talking about, conflicts between, let's say Israel and Palestine. Well, that's a conflict. This is a totally different thing. Or a conflict between Democrats and Republicans. This is a monarchy or an authoritarian regime that is seeking to control power and free speech and control what is written about them, et cetera, at all costs. And that cost, can equal, being jailed or beheaded or tortured or all of those, or in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, murdered, essentially for speaking or writing about problems that he saw within his own country and disagreeing with the Crown Prince.
Very well put. In that lens, to conclude, what can we in the peace and security field here in the U.S., what call of action should we take to enhance voices of activists and dissidents?
It's a complicated situation. I'm not a politician, nor am I, let's say, Jeff Bezos, and running a massive global company where the actions of that company can actually and ultimately affect policy change. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a storyteller. And so what I try to do in my work is bring matters forward through cinema and using the creative medium to tell a story. And hopefully that story has an emotional response. And that emotional response ultimately leads to conversations like you and I are having. And through mass education through the use as a medium to tell stories. Beyond that, we go into what is, policy change, and we go into governmental changes or corporate changes. And that, it becomes very complicated, because I don't know the reasoning why whatever this company or that company, chooses and makes a conscientious decision to continue to do business with, in this case, Saudi Arabia. These are things that I don't know what to do and to take action, other than what people do, which is tweet about it, write about it, get press about it, bring attention to the subject. And all these things, have been being done with the Dissident. But I think what we're seeing over and over again is that there doesn't seem to be a reality in meaningful action, that while there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of condemnation, of this murder, for example, and obviously there's others, in this case, we're dealing, with purely the matter of the Khashoggi murder, but, there's so many others in the kingdom that are suffering. But we're not seeing just a desire to really take action. And I think that's largely because of, all the politics in the region, and, and most likely, which I can't speak with true intelligence about, is just purely the money. The allure of selling hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons, not just from the United States. I mean, you have, Britain and France and Germany and other countries selling weapons to them, and obviously all the trade that's going on and investment ultimately makes it very difficult to have any sort of meaningful punishment. I think if this was another country or a poorer country without this kind of liquidity for investment, I do think we'd be probably seeing a different outcome.
Bryan, your film has educated us and brought awareness to the cause. We thank you for it here at Ploughshares. Thank you for joining us, and really great work. We all appreciate it, sir.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Derek Sender, Will Lowry, and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.